First, of course, I want to thank the conference organizers for this kind invitation. It's my first participation in this conference, and I'm quite happy to close it, not only because it's Friday evening, but also because it's my first keynote ever, and it's a rare opportunity to be in London on what I thought would be a historical day. But we will have to wait 2 more weeks. Second, yes, I must specify again that I'm speaking here today as an academic and not in my capacity as UN Special Rapporteur. So I would therefore request whoever will quote me or tweet not to use a UN Special Rapporteur hashtag, please. Nevertheless, I must admit that my ongoing monitoring of the situation of human rights in Belarus has inspired my choice for this topic for this lecture, because, I'm concerned, for example, among other issues, about discrimination, and the situation of the Belarusian-speaking minority is an issue dear to my heart. So I think there is no other country in the world where an official language is as discriminated against as it is in Belarus. We've seen already figures from the population censuses, which take place every 10 years. In 1999, 73.7% of Belarusians still called Belarusian their native language. In 2009, it was only 53.2%. This year, there will be another population census, which will probably reveal a continuous retreat of Belarusian as the everyday language. From what I know, almost 3 Belarusians out of 4 declare speaking only Russian at home, and only 2.2% speak exclusively Belarusian. So this has been in constant decline, and this is a matter of concern from a geopolitical standpoint too. And I'm actually, my original specialization is in international relations. As Zbigniew Brzezinski put it in 2012 in his book Strategic Vision, the domination of the Russian language is among the factors that justify him enlisting Belarus as one of the top 10, quote, geopolitically endangered nations. Previous annual lectures here often focused on Belarusian nation building and identity formation. Alena Markova spoke about the Bolsheviks' nationality policy of Belarusianization and Korenizatsiya in the 1920s last year, and she picked up from this topic this year in her communication dedicated to neo-Belarusization of the 1990s. So I will jump 20 years forward and address the ongoing phenomenon of soft Belarusianization. For the first time since Alexander Lukashenko came to power, Belarus is indeed experiencing a national awakening of sorts, and one that deserves scrutiny and conceptualization. What type of nationalism is it? Who are the identity entrepreneurs behind it, trying to build the Belarusian nation anew? And most importantly, what can this trend lead to? In other words, can soft Belarusianization sustain state building and contribute to the resilience of Belarus in the face of Russian integrationist pressures? Question mark. Or will it lead, on the contrary, to some adverse effects, enhanced pressure from Russia, which readily sees soft Belarusianization as a Russophobic type of nationalism? Again, I'm not an expert on the history of Belarus or the history of Belarusian nationalism and identity building. As an IR scholar, I've been mostly dealing with hard power politics and the geopolitical games unfolding with and around post-Soviet Belarus. So I do analyze this phenomenon, this soft Belarusianization, as an element of a wider geopolitical game. That is to say, the current struggle for the survival of Belarus as a sovereign nation-state in spite of external challenges that I believe limits the country's independence in international affairs. The fact that Belarus's sovereignty remains limited is the result of structural constraints inherited from the Soviet past. Belarus was among the most integrated with and dependent on core Soviet industries, and especially on the Russian military-industrial complex. Yet the policies of the Belarusian leadership over the past 25 years should also be held responsible for this state of affairs. The regime's economic and political dependence on Russia to date, and the subsequent difficulties that Belarus is now facing upon trying to break up from Russia's embrace, can be blamed on Lukashenko's voluntary Finlandization up until a very recent past. I don't know if you're familiar with this notion of limited foreign policy autonomy called Finlandization. So against this backdrop, the latest wave of Belarusian nationalism, which started some 10 years ago and accelerated following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, can be seen, I believe, as an anti-colonial type of nationalism in support of the right of Belarus to self-determination and avoiding forceful Eurasian integration or a Russian absorption. I'll do a little, come back on the definition. What do we mean with soft Belarusianization? It is unclear who first coined this term, but one thing is sure, Lukashenko himself used it in December 2017, answering Russians who were criticizing the fact that he would be supporting an unhealthy form of nationalism. And I quote him, "What do they accuse me of? That I launched soft Belarusianization in Belarus. But what do they expect from me? Germanization or what?" Yeah, very nice. The fact that President Lukashenko appropriated the term is illustrative of the political recuperation at work. In my view, soft Belarusianization is a bottom-up phenomenon rising mostly from societal initiatives. Yet it is clearly being instrumentalized by the regime for survival purposes in support of its foreign policy stance towards gaining more autonomy from Russia. The adjective soft here refers to the fact that soft Belarusianization is a discrete, moderate, and apolitical process. If we were to draw a parallel with soft power, soft Belarusianization could be understood as referring to the process of Belarusian nation building through attraction, rather than through coercive means, meaning that the very idea of promoting a Belarusian self-identity is now appealing for the wider public, which it was not in the past. Vadim Majejka, who's an expert with the Liberal Club in Minsk, has provided the following definition, which I quote. Soft Belarusianization, according to him, is the gradual, purposeful expansion of the use of Belarusian language, support for the development and dissemination of Belarusian culture, and the preservation and promotion of the Belarusian historical and cultural heritage. Those of you who have been to Minsk recently are aware of this trend, which has been developing over the past decade or so. It is obvious in the public space with the multiplication of visual symbols in national red and white colors, or vyshyvanki ornaments, as well as in the virtual sphere, where the Belarusian language is growingly being used, thereby contradicting the polls that I quoted earlier, and the statistics that register a steady decline in the share of Belarusian language speakers. In fact, the popularity of initiatives such as Mova na Nova language classes or Mova Cikava events convey the impression that people from all social strata are eager to learn and use Belarusian language more than before. This, in a way, echoes President Lukashenko's 2014 statement that, I quote, «Если мы разучимся говорить на белорусском языке, мы перестанем быть нацией. If we forget how to speak in Belarusian, we will cease to be a nation». But the ongoing national awakening is not solely a language-related issue, of course. More importantly, the way the Lukashenko regime is addressing the issue of identity building in this challenging geopolitical context cannot alone solve the many underlying challenges that stem from Belarus's continuous dependence on Russia. So before discussing this geopolitical dimension, I remind what are the origins and features of soft Belarusianization as I see them, to try and illustrate why, in my view, it amounts to an anti-colonial type of nationalism. So first, regarding the origins, I think that soft Belarusianization is more of a cultural phenomenon than a political or an institutional one. In practice, what we witness is Belarusians rediscovering the pre-Soviet roots of their history, the existence of which had simply been denied by the Soviet regime and ignored or discredited by the Lukashenko leadership for over 20 years. What soft Belarusianization celebrates is the unique cultural, literary, and architectural heritage of pre-communist Belarus. This is not a case of traditional nation building. My feeling is that the process is genuinely a societal one, directed against the colonial Russian occupant, and only later did it become a source of concern for the regime itself. Again, in the context of post-Crimea relations with Russia, soft Belarusianization is a windfall for Lukashenko's own regime survival strategy. In that sense, soft Belarusianization differs from the three main previous attempts at nation building, known as first the Belarusization of the 1920s, which Alina talked about last year. Second, the Belarusification that started in the early 90s, or eventually earlier, under the aegis of the nationalist opposition, notably the Belarusian Popular Front, but not only, also the governing structures were involved, but I don't know very well this period, so I will read your article very carefully. And third, it differs very much from Lukashenko's own so-called Creole nationalism. And this notion of Creole nationalism refers actually originally to the white racial movement of Euro descendants in Latin America and of Afrikaners in South Africa. So it means that for Creole nationalists, the fact that they trace back their cultural ancestry to Europeans is what that turns them into a nation. It's this filiation which turns them ethnically into a nation. So when scholars used this notion of Creole nationalism to talk about Lukashenko's nationalism of the 1990s and 2000s, I think this notion very much stresses the importance of the linkages with Russia in the building of a Belarusian identity. It's this filiation with Russia which justifies being a nation for Lukashenko. Because as, for example, David Marples put it, this is less Creole nationalism than national nihilism, meant to indefinitely extend the personal power of Mr. Lukashenko. It boils down to imposing the Lukashist thought, outlook, and way of life as a national ID, taking USSR as a model, and the union with Russia as a matrix for further state building. Since Soviet historiography consistently downgraded Belarusian language to the level of a dialect, while presenting Belarusian culture as a marginal, regional, backward one, under Lukashenko's Creole nationalism, the Belarusian language and culture have suffered the same fate. So against this backdrop, soft Belarusianization, which is happening now, appears as a revivalist trend. It is proactive. It relies on affirmative action measures, stressing, for example, how distinct Belarusianness is from Russianness. And it provides a response meant to counterbalance the result of over 2 decades of re-Sovietization and Russification that was orchestrated by the regime. As Piotr Ruskowski puts it, and his work was quoted earlier today from OSW. Since the mid-1990s, the regime ideologues have popularized the idea that Belarusian sovereignty was only possible within the United States of Russia and Belarus. The West was generally portrayed as the traditional enemy of East Slavonic civilization and thus of the Belarusian nation. So the image was needed above all in the fight of the regime against the democratic opposition, which was ideologically and financially linked to the West. Downgrading the European background of the Belarusian proto-state was a consistent way of making the population immune to Western democratizing influences. But again, this was an easy task, given that the yardsticks for self-identification that were planted in the Soviet times were never fully removed in Belarus after 1991. For example, when I was talking about the European background of the Belarusian state, it's of course filiation with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and that is very much what soft Belarusianization, in visual terms at least, is referring to. But this has always been denied in the early years of Lukashenko's rule. But nowadays, Lukashenko just had to give a sacrosanct purpose to the claim that Belarusian statehood dates back to 1991 only. This has been pretty much his constant position on this issue. And Prior to that, the Belarusian history from Polotsk Principality until Belarus allegedly became voluntarily part of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union is depicted in Soviet and in Belarusian official books, textbooks, as a period when Belarusian lands were conquered by and its people subordinated to the Lithuanians and Poles, and that, of course, Belarus, after joining Russia, benefited economically and culturally from this voluntary adhesion. So that's the anthem that history teachers in Belarusian schools must repeat, otherwise they can have serious problems. And I hear often about cases of repression and harassment for those from those who don't follow that line. As a result of Lukashenko's Russification policies, West Russism dominates the historical narratives and self-perceptions of Belarusians who have been repeatedly taught to feel part and parcel of the wider tri-national Rus. For them, the specificity of Belarusianness lays not so much in cultural or historical differences as the other way around, in total fidelity to Russian and ultimately Slavonic civilization. Therefore, the rediscovery of Belarusianness and the Belarusian language implies resituating the Belarusian past in its historical European context. In other words, it means looking beyond traditional Russophile historiography and also challenging the idea that the Belarusian nation never existed. And this is an idea that was actually even depicted by Western scholars who claim that there is, in Belarus today, there is a Belarusian people, there is a Belarusian citizenry, which is familiar because of its neo-Soviet features, but there is no Belarusian nation as such. So, of course, Belarusian scholars here would contest this, but unfortunately, this is pretty much the discourse that has been disseminated over the past years and about Belarus as a denationalized nation with not much to build upon. So I will not come back on the explanations for this weak national identity. Of course, the language is one part of it. In the public space, of course, the message that was disseminated by leading ideologues remained that Belarusian identity is closely tied to Orthodox Russian civilization, that Belarusians cannot survive alone outside of the Russian world. However, this narrative, this official narrative, has been seriously challenged by the war in Donbass. Whereas Russia made clear its neo-imperialistic ambitions with regards to its neighbors, the issue of Belarus's right to self-determination, or at least to having its own foreign policy interests, which differed from Russia's interests, for that matter, came back to the fore. Moving on to the features of soft Belarusianization, I believe that it is mostly nation building from the bottom up, and I know people will disagree with me, notably Poles. But again, as Vadim Mozheiko puts it, soft Belarusianization unfolded in three consecutive and complementary levels. First, the civil society sphere. If you look at the chronology, you can see that it's mostly in what is called in Russian the third sector, or the civil society organization, NGO community, that you can trace back elements of this national awakening. Second, the business and marketing sphere, because it turned out that national symbols are brandable. So a lot of the soft Belarusianization that we witness today in Belarus is actually just the result of pragmatic, not policies, but pragmatic initiatives from business people. And lastly, and very cautiously, it emerged in the governmental sphere. For many, soft Belarusianization looks like no more than a folkloric, low-key but fashionable trend. Some actually ridicule it, recalling that the Belarusian ethnos has few, if any, primordialist founding stones to build upon. For them, it is a provincial mistichkoye nationalism that cannot deliver substance for any significant change, because Belarusians would be too closely interconnected with the Russian matrix to ever develop a strong sense of identity. I would challenge that idea, and coming back on this three stages of the emergence of soft Belarusianization, I would argue that first, this social grassroots phenomenon, I admit, is a marginal hype trend activated by a handful of intellectuals who advocated the rediscovery and use of Belarusian language, partly with Western financial support or émigré support. So in that sense, it's not a massive movement, social movement. Nonetheless, it's a very interesting one, because the flagship initiative, which I think the soft Belarusianization process can be traced back, is the Budzma Belarusami campaign that some of you may know, and you've probably seen the video, famous video of the recalling the history of the Belarusian nation since the origins. So this campaign was launched in 2008 by Alena Makowskaja and Nina Szydlowska from the Association of Belarusians of the World, Batskaushchina, sorry for my Belarusian. So Budzma, since then, as a community-based network, organized thousands of events throughout the country with the aim of, I quote, deepening the national identity of Belarusians. So they involved a variety of social actors, cultural associations, artists, creators, intellectuals, historians, journalists, bloggers. Budzma coordinated the initiatives of both professionals and amateurs who were eager to valorize and popularize the Belarusian cultural heritage. It also inspired a multitude of other projects and get-togethers, notably in regional capitals. So it's not only a hype Minsk-based movement. So you have, for example, the Koło Siabrei in Mogilov. In Minsk, the most famous independent cultural center of this kind is Art Sadziba. And in a way, all these initiatives have met the demand for more Belarusianness that has accelerated over the past 5 years, as illustrated again by the popularity of the Mova na Nova language courses. Or, if you take another example, by the growingly nationalist postures of Belarusian football fans. So what sense can we make of this as a social but marginal movement? I think that with this, Belarus is finally catching up with the course of history, because what we see at work is quite similar to what was happening in the Baltic republics or in Ukraine at the end of the 1980s. So the emergence of Belarusian nationalism since the 2010s, for the past decade, appears as a natural, albeit belated trend. This national awakening aims at, well, first saving the Belarusian language from oblivion, and second, at counterbalancing what is widely seen among Belarusophiles as an excessive influence of Russian language, culture, and soft power, which expanded at the expense of indigenous Belarusian culture over the past 25 years. And I think it was very good that we heard Alena's presentation earlier today, because it showed that actually the country was much more Belarusian 25 or 30 years ago than it is now. But again, I think this is undeniably connected also with geopolitical events and with the unconscious fear that brotherly Russia could attack Belarusians in the same way as it went to war against Ukrainians. And actually the events in post-Euromaidan Ukraine have acted as an exogenous trigger, pushing Belarusians to stress what distinguishes them from Russians, something that helped many patriots to actually expand the field of the Belarusian national awareness. So all in all, I think that Belarusophilia and its natural flag bearers, the Belarusian-speaking minority, have a growing visibility in everyday life, and especially on social media. So of course you would tell me that, yeah, I'm socialized in the company of mostly Belarusian-speaking people, and that's why I notice a growth of the use of Belarusian language on Facebook. But I think that it is happening anyway. But again, it's quite marginal. So it would be misleading to claim that soft Belarusianization is giving rise to a massive mobilization. As Muzejko argued, many are joining the wave without any deliberate reflections, just to be trendy. Which leads me to my second point. This bottom-up social process is actually supported by market-driven logics. Belarusianness is a marketable good in its own right. Companies such as Coca-Cola and Velcom were among the first business actors who realized that using Belarusian symbols and language in their advertisement campaigns secured a 10 to 15% increase in sales. And other brands followed suit. This is a pragmatic, not an ideological dimension of this process. Only a small segment of the companies that started using Belarusian symbols for branding their products qualify as identity entrepreneurs. The rest just spotted that there was a societal demand or trend that could be turned into a commercial manna. And so they did. And we have several examples of these companies. You can see their T-shirts in all the 25th of March rallies, with this Pahonia symbols, national colors. For example, there's a company called Symbol.by, which specializes in the sale of clothes and souvenirs and trinkets using the colors of the Belarusian Popular Republic's flag, Vyshivanki ornaments, Belarusian shrift and slogans. Whereas this company mostly sells online. Last time I was in Minsk last May, I could see that it has a shop in central Minsk, and on the avenue on Independence Avenue, you have billboards with indicating with arrows the direction in Belarusian language where is the shop. It would have been unimaginable just a couple of years ago when anybody going out in the street with red, white flag would be simply arrested. From this, what conclusion can we draw? That I think it's a sign that this is tolerated, which again is in itself is a radical change. So I believe that leads me to my third point. The fact that the regime is tolerating this trend also means that it sees an interest in instrumentalizing it, because its rally around the flag potential is perceived as a windfall. And indeed, throughout, there were several elements showing that the government has instrumentalized this process. If I just list a number of these in chronological orders, as has been mentioned earlier, there were minor changes that were made in school textbooks already back in 2010, 2011, 2012. So official history textbooks started changing their approach a bit regarding Belarusian history, about the Polotsk, about the BNR, about Stalin crimes, etc. For the first time in 2 decades, Lukashenko delivered his Independence Day speech on 3rd of July 2014 in Belarusian, not in Russian. That was, of course, noticed by everybody. During an interview for Euronews TV on 1st of October that same year, Lukashenko struck at the very core of the Russian Kremnash propaganda by saying that in accordance with the Kremlin's logic, one could demand to return the Pskov and Smolensk regions to Belarus. Later on in 2015 came this event known as the nationalization of the St. George ribbon. So I won't go into detail, maybe because I have to finish soon.
5 more minutes.
Okay. But this and the attempts to ban or to rename the Immortal Regiment March into Belarus Remembers March is a sign of appropriation, renationalization of common Soviet heritage that is currently being used by the Kremlin to support its own geopolitical adventurism in the region. In 2016, the government launched the Vyshyvanka Day on the eve of Independence Day, and now even BRSM members are seen wearing Vyshyvanki. The uniforms of Belarusian athletes who went to the Olympic Games in Rio in 2016 were also redesigned, and now they wear national ornamented clothes. And of course, there's been various statements from ministers and from Lukashenko himself calling for some school topics such as history to be taught in Belarusian only. But this, however, has not been accompanied by any concrete plan for upgrading the knowledge of Belarusian of school teachers, not for revising the school programs or history manuals. And as I said, Belarusian-speaking school teachers keep on being harassed. On 3rd of July 2017, so again, Independence Day discourse, Lukashenko went as far as to claim that the Principality of Polotsk is our historical cradle, although up until then he considered anything predating the October Revolution as prehistory. That same year, in 2017, the Belarusian authorities were actively involved in the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the publication of the Bible by Francis Skaryna. So that year, the public space was filled with articles, slogans, and images of Skaryna and his work, which were mentioned in the government press almost as often as the Great Patriotic War. Again, this is a very significant, symbolic, but significant change. And the climax of this is, of course, the fact that the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the BNR on 25th of March 2018 was authorized. And the authorities even stated that there would be no BSSR without the founding of BNR. So this filiation that was always negated with the pre-Soviet proto-state of Belarus of 1918 has finally been acknowledged. So it is symbolically important. How then do we assess this movement? On the one hand, we can see that co-opted opposition or accepted opposition, such as Alena Anisim, the head of the Belarusian Language Society, considered that given the past position of the government and given the geopolitically limited room for maneuver, what the regime is doing is actually a lot to advocate a Belarusianization of public space and policies. But the meaning of these steps should not be overestimated, however, and I think this is the assessment that is being made by people living in Belarus who would like more Belarusianization. First, these steps were taken without any grand plan or background ideological mobilization in favor of a clearly defined national ID. These steps are all reversible. Would the wind blow in another direction and put the regime to get back to its usual pro-Russian routine on cultural matters? Secondly, the reforms are cosmetic only, as is always the case in Belarus. They too are reversible. There is no 5-year plan to Belarusianize the educational system. People have seen little, if any, progress so far regarding schools, and the situation in universities is even worse. Last year, the Belarusian Language Society started establishing a Belarusian-speaking university in Minsk. It was indeed registered and was awaiting the issuance of a license, but last month Lukashenko said that we don't need such a thing, so it will never see the light, probably. So in fact, the state efforts at Belarusicizing the public space are visible with the multiplication of road signs in Belarus, audio messages in train stations in the metro. There's toponymic change occurring, albeit not in a revolutionary way. And here or there you have a statue of some Polish, Lithuanian, Belarusian hero that is being erected, but soon after, defenders of Russophile memorial policy will come up and say, well, we need also a statue of Alexander II, which was happening in Vitebsk a couple of months ago. As for the linguistic scene, so we see it's only an apparent nationalization. And it certainly does not amount to de-Russification, because Russian remains the sole language of the public administration, even though both languages, as we know, have equal constitutional status as state languages. And the same Alina Anisim actually proposed a draft law to have new legislation drafted in both languages automatically, and it was rejected at the Higher House of Parliament. So it means that, all in all, the regime is doing too little, too late to counterbalance the influence of Russian soft power and disinformation at its source, that is to say, in the media sphere, which is dominated by Russian content. The Belarusian leadership has acknowledged that this domination is a potential threat, and it has taken some steps to deter it, asking, for example, that we get more Belarusian TV channels and radios to produce and broadcast more programs produced in Belarus proper. However, the impact of Russian world narratives and propaganda on average Belarusians remains huge. Not only do people trust Russian information sources more than Belarusian ones, be they governmental or independent media, they are also inextricably integrated in the so-called RUNet via search engines, mailbox providers, social networks, Vkontakte, Odnoklassniki, blogs, etc. And there is no comprehensive plan for increasing the resilience of Belarusian civil society or society in general against the corrosive influence of Russian propaganda. And that's the topic of this Chatham House paper I took part in that was mentioned earlier today. Nevertheless, I think that the fact that the authorities tolerated or the soft Belarusianization is significant, because it means that the regime has let a bottom-up process emerge, which is quite a new approach, and it's probably good news for the country. This laissez-faire is actually astonishing, because traditionally the regime doesn't leave much room for civil society initiatives at all. And the internal enemies of Lukashenko's regime was actually the nationalist opposition always, and therefore it's quite striking that the Lukashenko has let this soft Belarusianization develop in an almost unhampered way. The explanation, as I said, is probably that it sees an interest in using it. When it comes to the outcomes, and I will try and be brief, I think there are two intertwined side effects of soft Belarusianization which pose serious problems for the regime. First is the relation between this emerging national feelings, people's demand for more Belarusianness, and popular expectations in terms of democratic reforms. Because the emergence of Belarusian nationalism from below has already impacted on regime politics, opening avenues for more pluralistic developments and an unseen before cooperation at local level, for example, between state administrations and some civil society organizations. It is not structurally or substantially groundbreaking, but it is already a welcome change. And as we know, change brings change. So what can it result in? The other problem is the fact that soft Belarusianization is perceived in Russian intellectual and decision-making circles as a threat. So if it is perceived as a threat by Russia, then Belarus ends up being under threat from Russia. And in fact, a visible outcome of soft Belarusianization has been, from what I could see, the intensification of Russia's anti-Belarusian discourses since 2014, 15, 16. This again has been documented in OSW research by Kamil Klishinsky and Piotr Żochowski, the end of the myth of a brotherly Belarus. You have a whole list of research papers that were published in Moscow in the course of 2016 that were claiming that soft Belarusianization is happening in Belarus, and this is anti-Russian, this is disloyal, this is not natural, and it's not normal that the government doesn't do anything against it. It means it supports it. And in systematically drawing a parallel between emerging nationalism in Belarus and the, I quote, banderovtsi nationalism in Ukraine, Russia has kept the fear of a Russian aggression on Belarus pretty much alive in the minds of all Belarusians, probably Lukashenko included. So regarding the first side effect, Soft Belarusianization has raised hopes for more pluralism, and if it results in the Belarusian language being less discriminated against, I think this will be an improvement. What remains to be seen is further down the road if the authorities will eventually stop coercing independent civil society organizations and defend a more ambitious de-Sovietization of the Belarusian school curricula, or granting NGOs a voice and influence on public affairs, or discussing some issues which are dear to the heart of some Belarusophiles. And here I would take the example of among the most recent one of the other co-opted oppositionist in the parliament, Anna Konopatskaya, who recently asked on her blog for a referendum on leaving the Union State of Belarus and Russia. Can this be discussed? I doubt it. Popular support for the rediscovery of the Belarusian national identity signifies also that Belarusians are not as apathetical as is commonly thought. So again, we understand that Belarusianness is not soluble in Lukashenko's ideology, but and there is little reason as of now to expect that it could translate in an enhanced mobilization capacity inside society. However, I think there is the fact that there is just a little bit more tolerance on the side of the administration is positive. Of course, soft Belarusianization alone will not support the democratization in Belarus. I think this would be just romantic, wishful thinking. There is no ground to expect systemic change in the stemming from the upcoming elections. Nonetheless, I think that the regime will continue its recuperation efforts up to the point that it doesn't offend Russia. So again, as we know, this room for maneuver of the regime is probably narrowing because Russia has started to mobilize its hybrid warfare arsenal quite significantly and increasing the pressure, including, for example, in the framework of the Union State of Belarus and Russia or the Eurasian Union. We have heard some Russian ideologists who started blaming calling Belarusian nationalists Nazis. There's no banderovtsi in Belarusian history, but they started calling them Nazi in an article for example, from Vladimir Zotov. Батькины нацисты, белорусские правые зачищают страну от России, Лукашенко не против. So this is scandals from their side. Russian observers seem to be convinced that soft Belarusianization would not have been possible without the benevolence of the regime, and so it equates this with official support. So in a way, this puts Lukashenko under pressure too, because then they can accuse him of Russophobia, and as we know, this is the first step, as the Russians say actually, for justifying an intervention in defense of Russian interests against this radical nationalism, as was the case in Ukraine following Euromaidan, along the following line of argumentation that Maidan was a coup d'etat financed by the West. Those who ousted Yanukovych in 2014 were banderovtsi who installed the fascist regime in Kiev, and all those who support it are not with us, meaning they are against us, meaning they run the risk of a Russian military intervention too. And this kind of discourses you hear on Russian TV sets quite often about Belarusian nationalism. This, of course, is related with Belarus's current flirtation with the West and with the EU in particular, which irritates Moscow. I think that this is in that sense that we can speak of a growing pressure on the regime. So it puts the regime in a dilemma that on the one hand they feel that they need a civic nationalism of sorts, or national patriotism, to emerge and to spread in the country because of its rally around the flag effect, which can benefit, of course, Lukashenko's rating ahead of the elections. But on the other hand, the regime has to give Russians reassurances that Belarusianization is not directed against them. So this is a field for Belarusian public diplomacy, which needs to step up its limited capacity for fighting the Russian propaganda machine, while not crossing the red line that the Kremlin has set. So I guess I will stop here and be happy to answer questions if we still have time for this. Now I'll stop on this dilemma. Thank you.